In the winter mud of Liège, a German general expects the bullet his leaders promised him. It does not come. Instead, clean sheets, hot coffee, the hum of mercy. Months later, the war still rages, yet here in Mississippi, captives sip iced tea on shaded porches.
September 8, 1944, Liège, Belgium. The morphine hadn't taken hold yet. Major General Detlof Bock von Wulfingen lay in the rubble of what had been his field headquarters, his left leg twisted at an angle that made no anatomical sense. Shrapnel from the American artillery barrage had turned bone into fragments, flesh into something resembling ground meat. He could see white splinters protruding through his torn uniform trousers. The pain came in waves, each one convincing him this would be the last thing he'd ever feel. Above him, American voices, not the guttural shouting he'd expected, calm, professional. Someone was cutting away his boot with practiced efficiency. A face appeared in his narrowing field of vision, a medic, impossibly young, with freckles across his nose like constellations. "You're going to be okay, sir," the boy said in accented but clear German. "We've got you." Bock von Wulfingen wanted to laugh, or perhaps he did laugh. Morphine and shock were beginning their strange dance in his bloodstream. "You've got me." Yes, they certainly did. The question was, for how long would he remain alive? At 59 years old, Detlof Bock von Wulfingen had spent his entire adult life in service to Germany. Not as a frontline warrior, his expertise lay in signals and communications, the invisible nervous system of modern warfare. Field Commandant Headquarters 681 had been his responsibility, a position that carried the weight of Major General stars, but kept him largely behind the advancing and then desperately retreating German lines. He had never expected to see combat up close. He had certainly never expected to become a casualty. The propaganda he'd absorbed for over a decade painted a specific picture of American captivity, brutal interrogations, starvation rations, summary executions for officers. The Americans were cowboys, gangsters in uniform, their military a disorganized rabble held together by industrial might, but lacking the discipline and honor of the Wehrmacht. This was what he knew. This was what every German soldier knew. The reality began to unravel that knowledge within hours. The field hospital smelled of antiseptic and coffee. Not the ersatz coffee Germany had been drinking since 1942, the burned grain and chicory mixture that tasted like regret, but actual coffee. The aroma cut through even the medical odors, rich and impossibly luxurious. Bock von Wulfingen regained consciousness on a surgical table. Bright lights, clean white coats, the clink of metal instruments being arranged with precision. An American doctor leaned over him, checking his pupils with a small flashlight. "General," the doctor said in English, then switched to German. "We're going to operate now. Your leg is badly damaged, but we can save it. You understand?" He understood the words. He didn't understand the situation. "There must be others," he managed through cracked lips. "Your own wounded." The doctor looked at him with something like puzzlement. "You're wounded. That makes you a patient. We'll operate now. No waiting line. No triage tent where he'd be left to die while American soldiers received treatment first. Just immediate surgery, as if his nationality, his rank, his enemy status meant nothing against the fact of his shattered leg. The anesthesia took him before he could process this impossibility. When he woke again, his leg was bandaged, elevated, and still attached to his body. The surgery had taken 4 hours. An American nurse, a woman he realized with another jolt of cognitive dissonance, was checking his vital signs. "Doctor says you'll walk again," she said cheerfully in broken German. "Not run marathons, but walk. You're lucky." Lucky. A German general prisoner of war receiving the same medical care as an American GI. He lay there in the recovery ward, listening to the sounds around him. Soft conversation. The squeak of rubber-soled shoes on clean linoleum. Somewhere a radio playing Glenn Miller. Not the sounds of death, not the sounds of defeat, just the ordinary sounds of a functioning hospital. His worldview, constructed over 6 decades, reinforced by 12 years of National Socialist ideology, began to develop hairline fractures. The transport to Britain came 3 weeks later, after his leg had healed enough for travel. Trent Park, Camp Number 11, awaited him, the British facility specifically designed for captured German generals. The journey itself became another exercise in disorientation. They traveled in trucks with cushioned seats. They received sandwiches, actual meat between actual bread, and thermoses of hot tea. The British guards were correct, almost bored, treating their cargo of defeated generals like valuable but unremarkable freight. Bock von Wulfingen sat beside General Lieutenant Heinrich Kittel, an artillery commander captured in France. They didn't speak. What was there to say? Both men were processing the same uncomfortable data points that refused to fit their existing mental frameworks. Trent Park itself completed the initial phase of his education. The camp was actually a mansion, requisitioned from a British aristocrat, set in extensive grounds north of London. The German generals lived in rooms, not cells. They had access to a library. They could walk the grounds under minimal supervision. The food, while not luxurious, was regular and sufficient, more than could be said for Germany itself at this point in the war. "They're fattening us up before the slaughter," one general muttered during dinner. But even he didn't sound convinced. The real purpose of Trent Park would emerge later in captured British intelligence documents. The mansion was bugged, every room wired to record the conversations of its high-value prisoners. But the British approach was subtle, almost gentle. Create comfortable conditions, let the generals talk freely, and learn from their unguarded conversations. It worked. But it also inadvertently created an environment where German officers began to question everything they'd been told about their enemies. October 25, 1944, Bock von Wulfingen's name appeared on the transfer list. He was being moved to American custody, destination unknown. The news sent ripples of anxiety through Trent Park's genteel prisoner population. America, the land of gangsters and uncultured masses, where Negroes ran wild and Jews controlled everything, where soldiers were undisciplined and officers were selected by politics rather than merit. This was the America of Goebbels' propaganda, the America every German officer knew to fear. The reality waiting in Mississippi would break his mind more thoroughly than artillery ever could. The ship crossing the Atlantic took 2 weeks. Bock von Wulfingen spent much of it on deck, watching the endless gray ocean, his injured leg throbbing with the ship's motion. Around him, other German generals maintained their dignity through silence and distance. They were still officers, still representatives of the Wehrmacht, still German. But in quiet conversations after dark, doubt crept in. "Did you notice the American guards?" General Major Friedrich von Broich asked one evening. "They're reading books. Actual books, not regulations. I saw one reading Steinbeck." "Propaganda, probably," someone replied, but the response lacked conviction. The arrival in Newport News, Virginia, shattered another set of assumptions. The port bustled with an activity that seemed almost incomprehensible to men from a nation being bombed into rubble. Ships, trucks, mountains of supplies stacked with mathematical precision. The sheer abundance of material made Germany's war economy look like a corner shop. "This," General Lieutenant Hans Kramer whispered, "is what we were fighting." Camp Clinton, Mississippi, November 1944. The name meant nothing to Bock von Wulfingen until the truck carrying his group of senior officers pulled through the gates. What he saw made him close his eyes and open them again, testing whether morphine had somehow returned to hallucinate this impossibility. Individual houses, not barracks, actual small houses, each designed to hold 2 or 3 generals, with porches and indoor plumbing, and screens on the windows to keep out mosquitoes. The camp commander, a colonel whose name Bock von Wulfingen would later learn was Henry Harrison, greeted them personally. "Gentlemen," Harrison said through an interpreter, "you will be housed according to the Geneva Convention. You will receive the same rations as American officers of equivalent rank. You will have access to recreational facilities, reading materials, and writing supplies. You will be treated with the respect due to your rank." Bock von Wulfingen waited for the other shoe to drop, for the casual cruelty, for the humiliation. It never came. His assigned house had 2 bedrooms, a small sitting room, and a bathroom with running hot water. Hot water in a prison camp for the enemy. He sat on the bed, an actual bed with a mattress, not a cot, and felt something break inside him. Not his spirit, something deeper, the entire architecture of his understanding of the world. The daily routine at Camp Clinton was the antithesis of everything Bock von Wulfingen had been prepared for. Breakfast arrived at 700 hours. Eggs, bacon, toast, coffee, real coffee. The portions were measured to match American officers' rations, which meant they were larger than what Wehrmacht generals had seen in Germany for the past 2 years. Generaloberst Hans-Jürgen von Arnim, the highest-ranking officer in the camp, voiced what others were thinking. They're feeding us better than we fed ourselves. The library held over 3,000 volumes, including current American newspapers and magazines. No censorship beyond security concerns. The generals could read about Allied advances, about German cities burning, about their nation's collapse, all presented in matter-of-fact journalism that was more devastating than any propaganda. But it was the small details that accomplished what no interrogation could have achieved. The American guards played baseball during their off hours. They invited German prisoners to watch, to learn the rules, eventually to play. Bock von Wulfingen, his legs still weak but functional thanks to American surgery, found himself in the outfield one afternoon, fielding grounders while a farm boy from Iowa explained the infield fly rule. "It's to keep the game fair," the kid explained earnestly. "Stop the defense from getting cheap double plays. Fair." Americans were obsessed with fair. Fair treatment, fair rules, fair play. It permeated everything. Winter descended on Mississippi with surprising cold. The German generals, accustomed to winters that could freeze fuel in tank engines, found Mississippi's version mild but damp. The camp provided extra blankets without being asked. One evening in December, Bock von Wulfingen joined several other generals in the recreation room. Someone had organized a chess tournament. Others were writing letters home, heavily censored but permitted. A radio in the corner played American big band music. General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, who'd commanded Panzer Division, was reading Life magazine. He looked up with an expression of profound confusion. "Listen to this," he said. "An article about workers' rights. Union negotiations at a Ford plant. The workers are striking for better wages, and the article treats this as normal. Expected." "So?" someone asked. "So they're at war, total war. And they're letting workers strike?" Bayerlein shook his head. "We were told Americans would collapse under pressure, that their society was too soft, too undisciplined. But this," he gestured at the magazine, "this isn't weakness. This is confidence. They're so sure they'll win they can afford internal dissent." The silence that followed was heavy with realization. The real shock came in January 1945, when the camp received its first batch of German propaganda leaflets, dropped by the Luftwaffe over Allied lines and recovered by American troops, who found them so absurd they treated them as curiosities. Bock von Wulfingen read his own nation's propaganda with new eyes. American soldiers are degenerate criminals. He looked around the camp at guards who'd shared cigarettes, taught card games, treated prisoners with bored professionalism. American industry is on the verge of collapse. He remembered the mountains of supplies at Newport News. American society is mongrelized and weak. He thought of the efficient hospital that had saved his leg, the organized camp system, the casual abundance of everything. Every claim was a lie, not an exaggeration, a complete fundamental lie. How much else did they lie about, he asked aloud, to no one in particular. No one answered. They were all asking themselves the same question. The movie theater incident became legendary among Camp Clinton's German prisoners. Clinton, Mississippi, population 3,000, had one movie theater with one luxury: air conditioning. The owner, after some negotiation with camp authorities, agreed to allow small groups of German generals to attend evening showings. Von Arnim went first, accompanied by 2 guards. So, he returned 3 hours later, walking like a man who'd seen a ghost. "Well?" Bayerlein demanded. "What was it like?" Von Arnim sat down heavily. They were showing newsreels, then a cartoon, a mouse tormenting a cat, then a film about a family in California. He paused. The newsreel showed Allied bombing of German cities, Cologne, Hamburg. They showed it to their own people, didn't hide it. And afterward, he trailed off. Afterward what? Afterward, people bought ice cream and talked about the film. Not the war, the film. As if the war was just something happening elsewhere. They weren't afraid. They weren't angry. They were bored with it. He looked up. We're fighting people who are bored with the war, who treat it like a temporary inconvenience. Bock von Wulfingen understood. Germany had been on a total war footing since 1939, earlier if you counted rearmament, every aspect of life subordinated to the war effort. But America? America was fighting the most massive war in human history as a side project, while its citizens went to air-conditioned movies and debated union contracts and produced more materiel than the rest of the world combined. Germany hadn't lost to a worthy opponent. Germany had lost to a nation that wasn't even trying particularly hard. Spring brought new prisoners and new information. The Battle of the Bulge had failed. The Rhine had been crossed. Soviet forces were approaching Berlin from the east. The fanatical Nazis among the prisoner population, there were always some, retreated into denial or aggression. Camp administrators with characteristic efficiency transferred the troublemakers to isolated facilities designed specifically for unreconstructed National Socialists. This left Clinton's population increasingly composed of professional soldiers willing to accept reality. Bock von Wulfingen found himself in conversations that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. About Hitler's strategic incompetence, about the criminal nature of certain SS actions, about the fundamental rottenness of the regime they'd served. I never knew, was the common refrain. I never knew about the camps, the executions, the experiments. Some were lying. Some were truthful. All were being forced to reconcile what they'd believed with what they were learning from American newspapers, from Red Cross reports, from their own growing understanding that they'd been on the wrong side of history. One afternoon, a camp guard, a Jewish kid from Brooklyn named Moskowitz, sat down next to Bock von Wulfingen during exercise period. My grandfather came from Germany, Moskowitz said conversationally. 1887, Frankfurt. He sold fabric. Bock von Wulfingen said nothing. I'm just saying, Moskowitz continued, my family's German. Jewish German, but German. And now I'm guarding German generals who fought for a regime that would have killed my grandfather. He smiled without humor. History's funny that way. Why are you telling me this? Bock von Wulfingen asked. Because you guys still don't get it. You think you lost to Americans or Russians. You lost to an idea. The idea that maybe people shouldn't be murdered for their grandfather's religion. Crazy concept, I know. Moskowitz walked away, leaving Bock von Wulfingen to contemplate the crater where his ideology used to be. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered. The news arrived at Camp Clinton via radio, confirmed within hours by official camp announcements. The war in Europe was over. Germany was defeated. The Third Reich, promised to last 1,000 years, had collapsed in 12. The German generals in Clinton received the news in silence. No protests, no defiance. Just silence and the slow, painful process of accepting that everything they'd fought for had been reduced to rubble. Bock von Wulfingen sat in his small house, his leg aching with remembered pain, and tried to identify what he felt. Not pride. There was nothing to be proud of. Not shame exactly, though that was part of it. Not even grief, though grief was certainly present. What he felt was liberation. Liberation from the lie he'd been living. Liberation from the ideology that had poisoned his judgment. Liberation from the need to defend the indefensible. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd found freedom in captivity. The remaining 2 years of his imprisonment passed in a strange limbo. The war was over, but the process of repatriation took time. Camp Clinton's population fluctuated as some generals were transferred, others remained. New administrative categories were created and dissolved. Bock von Wulfingen spent his time reading, American history primarily. The Civil War fascinated him, a nation that had torn itself apart and somehow stitched itself back together. The Reconstruction period, with all its failures and partial successes, seemed almost contemporary in its relevance. They fought a civil war, he told Byerlin one day, killed 600,000 of their own people, and 70 years later, they're the most powerful nation on earth. Germany's been defeated twice in 30 years. What does that tell you about our choices? Byerlin had no answer. The camp library received a new shipment of books in late 1946. Among them, early academic works on the Holocaust, photographs, testimony, numbers that seemed impossible until you saw the evidence, 6 million. Bock von Wulfingen read until he couldn't read anymore. Then he read more. The privilege of ignorance had been revoked. Some generals refused to believe it. Propaganda, they insisted, Allied exaggeration. But Bock von Wulfingen had lived among the Allies for 2 years. He'd seen how they treated enemies with humanity. He'd experienced their casual competence, their abundance, their strength tempered by restraint. If they said 6 million, it was probably more. The regime he'd served hadn't just lost a war. It had committed systematic murder on an industrial scale. And he, Detlof Bock von Wulfingen, career signals officer, professional soldier, man of honor, he had been part of it, not in the camps, not pulling triggers or opening gas valves, but part of the machine that made it possible. This knowledge settled into his bones like shrapnel, permanent and painful. 1947, February. The call came early one morning, repatriation orders. Bock von Wulfingen was going home, or rather to what remained of home, a divided Germany, occupied and administered by the victors, its cities reduced to rubble, its population starving and traumatized. The irony struck him as he packed his few belongings. He'd eaten better as a prisoner in Mississippi than he would as a free man in Germany. The farewell at Camp Clinton was subdued. Handshakes with fellow prisoners, nods from guards he'd come to know. Colonel Harrison, older now but still crisp, returned his salute. "General," Harrison said through the interpreter, "I hope you find peace." "Thank you, Colonel. I hope I deserve to." The ship back to Europe retraced his journey in reverse, but the man making the crossing bore little resemblance to the broken, morphine-hazed general who'd been shipped westward 2 years earlier. His legs still ached in cold weather, souvenir of American artillery and American surgery, but his mind had been reconstructed more thoroughly than bone. The propaganda had been stripped away. The illusions had been shattered. What remained was a German officer who'd discovered that his enemies had been more humane than his own government, more honorable than his own ideology, more powerful than his own nation could ever have imagined. Germany in 1947 was unrecognizable. Cities were hollow shells. People scavenged for food and fuel. The occupation forces maintained order, but barely. The rubble of the 1,000-year Reich stretched from the Rhine to the Oder. Bock von Wulfingen settled in the British zone, finding work with the occupation administration. His signals expertise was still valuable, even in defeat. He remarried. His first wife had died in the bombing of Dresden. He built a small, quiet life among the ruins. But he never forgot Camp Clinton. In the decades that followed, through Germany's reconstruction, through its division and eventual reunification, Bock von Wulfingen would tell his story to anyone who asked. Not as a tale of defeat, but as a story of discovery. "I learned more about civilization in an American prison camp," he'd say, "than in 50 years of German military service." The young people born after the war didn't always understand. How could imprisonment be education? How could captivity be liberation? But those who'd lived through it, those who'd believed the lies and discovered the truth, they understood. Detlof Bock von Wulfingen died in 1984 at the age of 89. His leg, reconstructed by an American surgeon in September of 1944, lasted his entire life. So did the lesson learned in the strange, humane captivity of Camp Clinton, Mississippi. He'd expected death and received care. He'd expected brutality and received dignity. He'd expected propaganda and received truth. The shock of that discovery, the fundamental wrongness of everything he'd been taught to believe, had shattered his world more completely than any artillery barrage. But from those shards he'd built something new, an understanding that civilization wasn't measured by military might or racial purity or ideological fervor, but by how you treated those at your mercy. America, for all its flaws and contradictions, had taught a German general what his own nation had forgotten. The lesson took 4 years, 1 shattered leg, and the complete destruction of everything he'd believed. But it was a lesson he carried until his final breath.